Blog Talk Radio.
Okay, hello, folks. I'm Christy Peterson Schoonover, your hostess of Scary Scribes. I was supposed to play the normal intro music that you usually hear, but due to complications from Hurricane Sandy, it's been a little crazy around here today, and it's been a little crazy up in Canada too, and I can't figure out how to get it to play. So we are just going to go ahead and rock it through with this show. We are coming to you straight north, just north of Hurricane Sandy, who is about to make landfall in the United States in about 3 hours. This is episode 9 of Scary Scribes. First off, to all of our Canadian listeners out there who have sent us best wishes, thank you. We are still here in Danbury, Connecticut just fine for now. Like I said, I'm your host, Chrissy, author of Skeletons in the Swimming Hole, Tales from Haunted Disney World, and Bad Apple. And tonight, our very special guest is Kevin Lucia. He is the contributing editor for Shroud Magazine and a blogger for Midnight Diner. His short fiction has appeared in several anthologies, and he's currently finishing his creative writing master's degree at Binghamton University. He teaches high school English and lives in Castle Creek, New York, with his wife and children. He is the author of Hiram Grange and the Chosen One, Book 4 of Hiram Grange Chronicles, and he's currently working on his first novel. So now, I give to you a little bit of Hiram Grange and the Chosen One. Erin Donahue was late. She scrambled around her flat, getting dressed for tonight's concert. If she hurried, there'd be enough time to practice. God knows she needed it. Not for the first time. She cursed foster mom for the long-winded phone lecture that had made her late to begin with. Of course, foster mom could care less. A professional music career couldn't compare to settling down and starting a family. She'd never be satisfied until Erin did so, and had spent a good 2 hours yakking about it over the phone. Erin clicked through her flat on black stilettos. Hell with it. I'm not your real daughter anyway. Why should I listen to you? Men found her attractive, and her sexual appeal matched her musical one. She'd entertained many lovers. Most of her couplings never lasted long, but that suited her fine. Foster mom could go hang for all she cared. She stopped before a hall mirror and tugged at the black, clinging dress that normally looked stunning. Of course, foster mom had gapped so long she hadn't had time to iron it before dressing. Score another notch in foster mom's column for making life difficult. She huffed at the mirror's wrinkled reflection, gave her hemline a last tug, then went into the dining room to practice a few rushed sets before leaving. Her gaze fell upon today's mail on the kitchen table. She hadn't noticed earlier, but amidst them was a small, padded manila envelope. Her address had been typed. There was no return address. Erin grabbed it, tore it open, and emptied its contents into her palm, a heavy medallion on a chain, made of dull pewter, ringed with strange symbols. In its center gazed an embossed eye, surrounded by what seemed to be tentacles or waving arms. Erin stared. Part of her felt sickened, but another part shivered, strangely thrilled. The medallion symbols resonated of deep, unknowable things, evoking sensations similar to those invoked by music. A bit odd for my tastes, but why not? She thought. She slipped the medallion over her neck, approaching the hallway mirror for a good look. Nestled above the swell of her breasts, it contrasted nicely with her black dress. neither too big nor too small. She regarded herself in the mirror with a raised eyebrow. Well, don't I look ravishing? With a playful swish of her bobbed hair, she turned away. Time to practice. The medallion felt warm against her skin. She breathed so heavily from rushing around that the rise and fall of her chest made it seem as if the medallion throbbed of its own accord. She'd been struggling to find her rhythm for 20 minutes, playing with one eye on her sheet music, the other on the clock, when her throat tickled mid-note and the trumpet uttered a metallic squeak. She tried to continue, but the tickle exploded into a full-blown cough. She jerked the trumpet away. Hand over mouth, Erin coughed, her body bent by sudden gut-wrenching spasms. With each hack, saliva filled her mouth. Her face burned. Damn it, I'm not missing this concert. Jan will have my head. Another cough. The tickling subsided. She remained bent over for several seconds, savoring the sudden rush of peace. Then she opened her eyes. Blood covered her hand. She tasted a copper saltiness. Her stomach froze as she looked in the mirror. Thick blood covered her lips. Something small and white wriggled at the corner of her mouth. Dazed, she wiped it and touched something slick and wet. When she pulled her hand away, it was coated in red. Almost candy apple red, she thought. And in her palm shivered the thing she'd seen on her face, a white worm. Revulsion filled her. It had come from inside her. It had caused the tickling. Horrified, she flung the thing away, but almost immediately her coughing resumed, more violently than before. She doubled over again, but this time didn't bother covering her mouth. She spewed bloody clots, which painted the floor with bright red starfish patterns. She felt a liquid coiling inside. Her guts squirmed. She looked at her trumpet's mouthpiece and whimpered. Blood dripped from it. She'd bled from her mouth while playing and hadn't noticed. Her mind teetered when she saw worms poke their heads from the mouthpiece. She gagged, threw the trumpet away, and staggered towards the kitchen garbage to vomit. With a rocking leap, the trash bin jerked, and she skidded to a halt. A pregnant quiet filled the room. The lid flipped up and down. Something inside batted it, almost playfully, as if taunting her. It flipped up and down again, opening and closing. She jerked every time. The medallion burned against her skin. The lid flipped to open again, but this time something caught it from inside, held it open a crack. Maggots poured out and down the can to the floor, a blanketing army of whiteness swarming towards her. She swayed as they piled around her feet and squirmed up her ankles. She gazed blearily at the garbage can, lid still open a crack, and saw eyes blinking in the can's darkness. As the maggots burrowed through her stockings and then skin, squid-like tentacles curled over the can's edge and flicked the air. She stared, mesmerized, as fleshy arms slowly unfurled. Something heavy and slick rose from the garbage can. Eyes glittered. She screamed as it tumbled from the can, bounced off the floor, and flew at her, tentacles weaving, eyes blinking, mouths puckering. And there you have it. A very entertaining and wonderful section from Kevin Lucia's Hiram Grange and the Chosen One. And we have Kevin on the phone right now. And as I said, I know you guys are used to an ad, but for some reason I can't get the audio to work tonight. So we're just going to go with it. So hi, Kevin. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. How was the reading?
It was excellent. It was excellent.
Really?
Good to hear that section again.
Okay. So, first of all, let's talk a little bit about what you do. Let's talk firstly about the Hiram Grange series, because I don't think a lot of our listeners are actually familiar that it is a series and that this is a recurring character, correct?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so can you tell us a little bit about that, or what he's all about,
Sure.
how many books there are, stuff like that?
Sure. The Hiram Grange Chronicles was actually developed by Shroud Publishing. It was the brainchild of Tim Deal, the owner and editor and publisher of Shroud. And he came up with it about 2 or 3 years ago on one of the Shroud message boards. He had posted that he was looking to start a series, a novella series, kind of like a pulpy novella series centering around one recurring character. And I had sold a couple stories. I'd sold a story to Abominations and to Northern Haunts, so that had introduced me to Shroud. So a bunch of us all pitched ideas, and he really liked the ideas, so we began, putting this thing together from the ground up. The website is www.hiramgrange.com, and that's basically the website that's got all the stuff on there. And yeah, there are 5 books in total. Book 1 is Hiram Grange and the Village of the Damned by Jake Burroughs. Book 2 is Hiram Grange and the 12 Little Hitlers by Scott Christian Carr. Book 3 is Hiram Grange and the Digital Eucharist by Robert Davies. Mine is Book 4, Hiram Grange and the Chosen One. And Book 5 is Hiram Grange and the Nips of Krakow by Richard Wright. It is a series, but it's not as sequential. Like it's not like every single one ends and the next one begins. So it's more like, you want to think more like the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes or something like that, where there's a reoccurring character, but every episode is self-contained. And even though while you're reading them, you'll recognize bits from the other stories, you don't necessarily have to read them in order. There's no plot arc that necessitates you start with the first one and end with the fifth one.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I've read all 4. Well, the first 4 I've read. I haven't gotten to book 5 yet. And I noticed that one of the big allusions in here, if you will, and possibly I could tie this into themes, is there's a lot of Lovecraft in here. And there are a lot of references to, in all of the books so far that I've read, starfish and octopus, and could you kind of, and that's a very Lovecraftian sort of, theme, because that ties into Cthulhu. Could you talk a little bit about that and why, well, let's start with the first thing. Why do you think Lovecraft was so interested in that? Like, there's no right or wrong answer here. I just noticed that in all of his work. I've read a lot of his work, and there's always this octopus, squirmy, endoskeleton creatures seem to take over. And so I'm always fascinated by that. So do you have any theories on that?
I don't know about the octopus squid thing, especially if you're reading The Shadows in Mouth and you got these fishy beings and things like that. But I know just as far as because he's got other stories too that don't necessarily have the tentacle aspect to them, but he was definitely very, very interested in the idea of this mythos. I know growing up he was very much into Greek mythology. He loved the pantheon and the idea of this whole grouping of gods and things like that. But he imagined a pantheon of gods that were amicable to humanity. That they could care less about us, and that we were basically food for them. So what I've always thought is very fascinating about Lovecraft is his ideas that everything that all the stories that we know, all the legends, all the myths, all the folklore, are all connected to a pre-existing mythos, and I think that's the real achievement of his work. Not so much his prose, because I think his prose varies from story to story, but just the way he envisions, he's even touched upon fairies, with Shub-Niggurath and the black goat of 1,000 young. He's touched upon mer people. So I think I can't really answer why there's lots of squiggly, octopi imagery, but I know he did a wonderful job of just connecting all of these, the mythology and legends together, pointing towards some predating, and it's the influence is long-reaching. I mean, if anyone, I just got a chance to watch The Cabin in the Woods yesterday. Joss Whedon's little horror movie. Have you seen that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I
yeah.
actually.
Yeah,
that was a good little movie. That was a lot of fun.
The old ones, the ancient ones are in that movie too. So it's like, I mean, this is something that he touched off that I think every horror writer at some point, either tries to write their own Lovecraftian story or they just find themselves. And especially because Hiram Grange is meant to be a pulp. I think it's, when I think of pulp writers, I automatically think of, Lovecraft, and I think of Robert Howard, and guys like that. So, I don't know. I can't speak for the other guys, but I knew from the beginning that the Lovecraftian angle was something that I wanted to, write about, but I wanted to deliver it in this maybe a little bit more of a, a readable fashion. So.
Well, you know what I've always found interesting about, a lot of pulp writers, and of course those run the gamut. We could go all the way back to the 40s and 50s. We could go into, the Dream of Electric Sheep. We could even go into, the name escapes me at the moment, Philip K. Dick.
Okay.
What I always found interesting, because Philip K. Dick was also a blend of pulp and science fiction. Mm-hmm. I've read a lot of Lovecraft, and I've often wondered if he was, that's why I thought it was interesting why you brought up pulp, the pulp of his day, so to speak.
Oh, because yeah, definitely was, yeah.
Yeah, because at the root of all the pulp stories, the major theme goes back to almost this ancient Greek mythos of, I'm stuck between Scylla and Charybdis. What's the choice I have to make? And I do think that in Hiram Grange, in the first 4 books that I've read, I haven't read the 5th one yet, there's definitely an element of that in there, where the character has to make a choice. Yep. And it's not a fun choice.
Right.
So I don't know if you want to elaborate on that at all, but...
Hard to really tell, maybe I can elaborate on that by sharing a little bit of the writing process of all 5
please do,
books.
yes.
Yeah, I'm not sure the reason why is we approach this in a very unique fashion is that and it's one of those things that I thought was very interesting, it was intriguing and immersive, and I never want to do it ever again. But all 5 of us wrote the novellas at the same time.
Wow.
Yeah, because what Shroud really wanted to have a short, bursts of time in between each release. He didn't want to release one, Tim didn't want to release one and have 2 years later have the next one come. So we were all writing at the same time and shooting emails back and forth. We had to create this extensive, Bible, if you will, of who he was, what his traits were, all the millions of little things that will never make it into the story, but we all needed to know, so we would know what his habits were and his traits. And we would be emailing back and forth and saying, okay, I just did this, and somebody else would be like, well, I just did this in my story, and that might come after you, so I'm not sure if that can happen. So we had all these things. So it was really kind of a collective effort. So I guess we know that there's a very light arc in the background that I'm really, I really can't elaborate on, because I know that eventually if you want to call the first 5 books season 1, there's a season 2 coming eventually that's supposed to, pull the trappings away and reveal things to hear him a little bit more about the world around him. But I think probably if there's a similarity between the books and those ideas, it probably was just generated collectively because we are bouncing the stories back. We have an arc that Hiram is following, but as far as our own stories, we just kept, throwing bits and pieces at each other for probably, it was a feverish, 3 or 4 months over the summer. We were just writing and emailing back to each other every other day. So, like I said, it was very, very interesting to go about doing it. I'm not sure if I'd want to do that again, but there was a lot of rewrites involved. You write an extensive scene involving this thing, and then you post it out, and someone's like, oh, yeah, but he can't do that if I'm going to do this in my book. I'm like, oh, okay. So, like I said, it was very interesting, but I'm not sure if I'd want to do it again.
Yeah, I would think that would be tough, collaborating with many different writers. Because I know myself as an independent writer, you make your own rules.
Right.
And I think it's tough when you get with others just because it's not like you don't want to work with them or you don't think their work is great too. It's that all of a sudden you have to invent rules that work in integral fashion. And I think that's even harder because you can't just make up stuff.
I gotta be. First of all, I gotta give Tim Deal the ultimate props because he was very, very permissive about the stories we wanted to tell. You know, most of the continuity we had to be mindful of was just Hiram himself. You know, as far as his character traits and how would he react in a certain situation, and you know, because we can't have him generally behaving one way in one book and then have him doing the totally radically different thing in another book, you know, and as far as his traits, the weapons he liked to use, things like that. But as far as developing the stories, he was great, you know, and just allowing our own, even like the prose, like if you've read, you know, Scott's Hiram Grange and the 12 Little Hitlers, which is a wonderful but also painful read, because it's all third person present tense, and it's kind of like a severe mind, you know, mind trip. But the whole book is a mind trip because Hiram's on a mind trip in that book. He allowed us the room to, you know, bring our own voices to the table and things like that. And I got to say, this could have been fodder for lots of disagreements and things like that amongst the five writers, but it was really was a testament to the other four writers and their ability to write professionally and to work collaboratively and to have an end goal in mind, because there was never a moment of like you know, acrimony or anything like that. We all worked together, and it was, like I said, I don't think because of the amount of rewrites involved, I'm not sure, I don't think it's something I'd want to get involved again in the future, but it certainly wasn't, you know, there's no tension or anything like that between the writers, which I thought was a really good experience.
Okay. So what are some of your plans to work with the Hiram Grange character, if you will? Even if you, okay, I guess what I'm going for is, did you feel a connection with this character? Because you did say you were writing it collectively. So because you didn't come exclusively out of your own head, I'm just curious about how that affected you, and were you able to form a connection?
Yeah, it admittedly took a really long time for me because I'd actually never really envisioned myself as a pulp writer, and in fact, most of the short fiction that I've written, you know, and the current novel, the two current novels in progress, you know, most of them are all just straight, you know, normal person in a weird situation, you know, that sort of thing. So it did take me a little while to dial into the character, but once, for me, you know, when you really get to know the character's flaws and their emotional trauma and things like that, you know, that is always the connection for me. I know my very first couple drafts of Hiram were just awful because I was writing toward the pulp, you know, caricature. I was making him pulpy and over the top and outlandish, and it was just all sounding awful. And then I went back to the Bible, or if you will, I went to the back to the Bible. I went back to the original guidelines we set up, and I started reading again. And I start reading in like some of the background of Hiram Grange is that, you know, his mother commits suicide right in front of him when he's 12 years old. His father disappears. And now the image that's starting to develop in my mind is that really he's a, you know, middle-aged orphan who lost his mother. He's still wearing his father's old suits, and his main gun is the gun that he watched his mother use to kill herself. I'm like, this guy's got serious abandonment issues. He's missing his father, you know, and then my book also takes place after, not to give out any spoilers, but he takes place after something traumatic happens to someone close to him. So then I developed the character of Therese. So when I was able to dial into his emotional foundations, you know, which was, again, I was very fortunate. The way Tim had set this character up, you know, with, like I've told him, I said, I would always love to write another, you know, Hiram Grange story that deals with finding his father. because for me, something like that, the emotional subtext there, are far more like the gun and the Webley and the Lovecraftian and the magic and the tentacled monsters. It was enormous fun to write, and I had to. I was speaking to Norman Prentice, author. He's written for Cemetery Dance, and he said to me, he's like, "It was really a fun read. You must have enjoyed writing it." And I'm like, "I did. It was a lot of fun to write." So all that pulpy stuff is really fun, but what really most motivates me is that emotional subtext. You know what I mean? When you start really looking at who he really is, when he, who is Hiram Grange when he looks in the mirror, and that's what really motivated me to write him. So when I clicked that, and I'm like, this is a guy who's just, he lost his mother and he's eternally trying to satisfy his father's image of him. Then from then on in, the writing was, not once it was easy, but then I had my angle. You know what I mean? I felt like I had latched into him, and this is the Hiram Grange I wanted to write about. So.
Yeah, and I think that is, one of the themes of loss.
Yes, it's so huge. Yes, and he has lost so much.
Yep. And even go ahead.
Oh, sorry. And he's lost so much by his own hands. He has done so much. He's lost so many people because of his own actions. So, and I found a lot of room to play with that.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that really attracted me to the series. Mm-hmm. I remember when they first came out. I got book one, and I don't remember how I got book one. I don't know if it's because Tim said, "Oh, you need to read this," or, I probably saw it on some post on one of the many boards that you and I are on Facebook together, like Alone with the Horrors, Horror Fiction, or any of those. But I was like, that sounds really interesting. And it had kind of been slanted toward Lovecraft. And I'm not a Lovecraftian. I'm a Poe person. There's always that big joke, are you Lovecraft, are you Poe? But I was like, this sounds really interesting. I'm going to check it out. And one of the first things that I picked up on was this intense theme of loss. And I think that's a very universal theme. And, you had very graciously loaned me that Philosophy of Horror series to check out, to put on my blog while I was getting married and running around like crazy and couldn't do anything. And I was just so impressed with that series because there's one strain in there, and I forget in which of the posts it was in now. And I don't even know if you directly stated it, but I just remember getting the impression he's talking about loss here as a form of horror. Abandonment issues, being abandoned as an adult, being abandoned as a child, having your life change in one split second.
Yep.
And I truly believe, I don't know if you want to elaborate on this, but I personally truly believe that that's a very good, seed of horror. I think that's one of the many seeds that are out there.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. It's one thing I've become convinced more and more in the last couple of years is that horror is probably one of the most diverse and widest genres that exists, and that and there's so much out there that's being published that may not necessarily have the label horror on it, but it certainly could easily fit in there. And yeah, when I was doing the reading for the philosophy of horror and things like that, and really realizing how much wider the genre can be defined, depending on your reading habits and what your preferences are and things like that. But really, at the core of it, all horror, it can be read as a story of loss, or something like that. Yeah, I definitely agree with that assessment.
Yeah, did you ever read Burdick's book, actually?
No, I did not.
No, there's a really good book out there, and it's rare. And I only found it when I was doing my undergraduate thesis, and it was very difficult to get my hands on at the time. Okay. I'm going back to 2004, and back then, believe it or not, those of our younger listeners might not remember that getting things online was not that easy.
Right.
Even as recently as 8 years ago, you still had to go through interlibrary loan and stuff to get books.
Right. Yep.
There was a book by Michael J. Burdick called, I don't remember the name of it, but it had something to do, I can get you that, or I can put it in the show notes or whatever. But it's really interesting, and you should read it. And it was basically about Poe's trigger theories. Like the whole idea, of Edgar Allan Poe's 4 trigger theories. And what he did was he analyzed every single story that Poe wrote, and he broke it down and said, this is the nature of where the fear is coming from. I.e., there's an obsession that has not been fulfilled, like in Morella or in Ligeia. There is a passion that has not lived out. There is a vengeance or a guilt that hasn't been relieved, like in Berenice or in Telltale Heart. It was a fascinating book. And, I mean, I don't know. I don't know if I think I saw some of that in the Hiram Grange series, but I don't know how much that played into it.
I think it really, I think, and that's another thing that, going back to the philosophy of horror, one of the things that Noel Carroll, and again, if anyone, that I recommend that book very highly, The Philosophy of Horror by Noel Carroll, because it does a very nice job. One of the things he really speaks of in there, and I also saw Stephen King speaking of this in Dance Macabre, is that if we're, if as a horror writer, we feel like we're operating, I think, within a tradition. You know what I mean? Like, this is the horror tradition, this is the horror genre. We probably have all read these stories.
Yeah. Are you there?
Even before I'm still there. Yeah, even before I identified myself as a horror writer, I read Edgar Allan Poe as a kid and things like that. And I think once we've ingested these stories and read them over and over again, it simply becomes part of our writing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like I said, I can't say that any one of us in Hiram Grange probably necessarily put those theories in there on purpose, but knowing all the guys and knowing all their reading habits and knowing how widely read, someone like Rob Davies and Richard Wright and and Scott, we've read these things and read, and we've all pursued different levels of graduate study. So this is something that's become part of us as writers. You know what I mean? These themes. And that was something that Noel Carroll had said, is that people who write within that tradition are very aware of that. They've ingested all of these stories, and now they're working them out in their they said in their own way. They're paying homage, but they're trying to do something different with it. They're trying to do something fresh.
Yeah, and I do think that as a horror writer, that is the challenge, because we do come out of our own experiences, and trying to interpret that in terms of horror sometimes does get restrictive because of some of the tropes that are out there that we're used to. The dying mother in the bed is a big one. The parents who are oppressive is another big one.
Right.
The loss of the dead person that they never reconciled with, whether it be a girlfriend, a husband, a lover, a parent, whatever. That's a big one. And I think the big challenge is to try to break out of that mold, but still make it accessible.
To still make it accessible, and not only that, but to make it simply good writing. And I've run into this as a reviewer, because I don't review as much as I used to, sadly, just because I'm so busy. But all the reviewing that I used to do, I don't know how many times I'd receive these ARCs, and the blurb would be something along the lines of, bends the genre, something new and fresh, and I'd read it and be like, yes, but they can't write at all. You know what I mean? It's like this may be new and fresh and unique, but the internal logic does not work at all. So I think that's an even bigger challenge, is you're looking at a story and you're like, how do I make this new and fresh and have it not be something that hasn't already been written, but how do I still write it well? I know for me as a reader, if I had to choose between a story that was fresh and unique, but wasn't really written well, and I had to, between that and a story that, okay, maybe we've heard this story before, but at least the person wrote it well. As a reader, I'd always choose the second one. So I think you're right. That's the biggest challenge: is how do I write it new, but then how do I still write it well? You know what I mean?
Yeah, and that's tough because that's where you sometimes cross the line. And I know that you are pursuing, creative writing at Binghamton University, so I'm sure that you, in some cases, are running into the same issues that I ran into a few years ago. How do you make it good but still make it valuable writing? In other words, there are loads of books out there, and I will say there are loads of books out there that are beautiful. They are so beautifully written. And you get to chapter 5, and you just go, okay, what's going on in this book? you know what I mean? You have and I think that's one of the challenges with horror and sci-fi and fantastical fiction is that there still is that line. Like Stephen King is very well respected in some circles.
Yep.
He has, by his own admission, come out and said that he's not well respected in other circles. And I understand that because he's a genius when it comes to horror, but he is on that literary line. If you look at things like The Shining, that is actually a very literary book. It's got the whole circle, of coming back and to all the demons and all that stuff, but it's written in vernacular, but done just vernacularly enough that it's literary. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm convinced that 20 years from now, if not even now, he should be. 20 years from now, he'll be studied. I think one of the things that fascinates me about Stephen King is here's a guy who started solidly in that pulp. Some of his best first sales were to adult magazines. You know what I mean? Those are, but he's come from that to, and he's also had his. We have to be fair too. He's also had his throwaway, incomprehensible novels.
I would
by
agree
his
with
own
you.
admission. Yeah, like Tommy Knockers. I'm not sure what was going on. But then that same guy also wrote things like you're saying, The Shining and It and Salem's Lot and Duma Key was wonderful. And this is and we run into this a lot, teaching, because I teach high school English and I teach sophomore honors and senior honors. So we end up getting into this term literary. What does literary mean? And it's such a slippery term. Anyway, we're discussing it at the graduate school level because what was literary 20 years ago, maybe it's not literary now. Perfect example. Moby Dick was a failure and ruined Melville's career. Never wrote another word. I mean, he wrote after that, but it just destroyed him. Then somewhere in the 1940s, someone goes, no, wait, Moby Dick's an American classic. So how does that play out? But what I always tell the kids is the best, maybe the most sensible and basic test for is this literary, is this pop fiction, is that the greater the theme hinges on commenting on the human experience. What is it saying about what it means to be human? What is it saying, about what it means to suffer and to succeed and to strive and to be human? The more it hinges on that, and the more people can attach themselves to that, then I would say that however much literary value it has, the greater literary value it has. Like I always tell the kids, again, 20 years from now, I believe Harry Potter will still be widely read. Twilight?
Yeah. Yep, I do too.
And I'm not slamming Twilight, but what is it? Again, Stephen King, I think, said it best, is that when you analyze all the themes of Harry Potter is about facing your fears. It's about facing an unpleasant destiny. It's about beating your own inner demons and discovering your true worth as a person, whereas Twilight is about how important it is to have a boyfriend.
Yeah.
Which is not too, again, and Twilight does have its, I was talking to my sister about it, and I said, I don't get it. I don't know why everyone likes Twilight so much. And my sister goes, well, I get it. And I'm like, well, what do you mean? She was like, well, do you remember my senior year? Do you remember that Swedish exchange student that I just stared at for the whole year, and I wouldn't talk to him, and he wouldn't talk to me? And I'm like, okay, so it obviously is hitting some vibes, but because the Harry Potter series, I think, was able to access a wider range of themes that all of us can connect to, whatever you want to call literary, its literary value is going to be greater someday. You know, that's my
agree.
like armchair. You know, that's the discussion we get in every year with the kids. You know, my students. Another really trite example is I ask them how many of you were all raised on Dr. Seuss. You know, they all raised their hands. You know, it's because for whatever reason, even now, like I'm raising my kid on Dr. Seuss because we all recognize something in Dr. Seuss that we want to pass on. And then I asked my kids, well, how many of you guys have all read the Hardy Boys? None of them. Absolutely none of them. You know, and I was raised on the Hardy Boys, but somewhere in there, they just fell out of step. So, you know, either they didn't have necessarily as much literary value. They were very reflective of the times, so they're more pop, you know, which is not, we're not separating these into good and bad, because I think that happens sometimes. You know, I think it happens, literary good, pop bad. It's just what they do. It's not whether they're good or bad, I don't think. So,
I was going to say the same thing.
Opinion.
Yeah, about when I was a kid, Judy Blume was the big deal. You know, Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. Forever, which, my God, was so dirty we had to put paper lunch bags over the covers of the books so we could bring them into school. But they were like the twilights of their time. They spoke to us as a generation at that time. The more I talk to other writers on Facebook and other readers on Facebook, and we joke around, Judy Blume only comes up as, wow, I remember having to read that, and I had to put the paper bag on the cover. Like, it's that type of thing. I don't think it's Judy Blume stands today. Like, as you say, Moby Dick, which, like you're saying, it taps into that universal theme of loss. I mean, Moby Dick is all about chasing your ambition to the point of destruction, whether that be a man, a drug, a job, money in a big house, you know, whatever that is. And I think that's why somebody in the 40s or 30s turned around and said, oh, my God, this book is a classic, fabulous, because it does speak to all of us.
Little late for poor Herman, but...
Poor Herman, who also wrote Bartleby the Scrivener, which was... My father loved that book. I personally couldn't deal with it, but there was something in my dad that connected to that book.
Right.
And he always used to say to me, I love Bartleby the Scrivener. I think that was better than Moby Dick. And he was an English teacher, too. And I'd be like, okay, whatever.
My students aren't fond of Bartleby either. I still foist it upon them every year, but they're not so much fans of Bartleby either. So.
No, and I don't know. I mean, I did read it. Admittedly, I got halfway through it, and this was a while ago. This is when my father was still alive, so this had to be 10 or 15 years ago, and I couldn't connect with it. But therein lies another discussion that I often find interesting. We often have this argument, particularly as writers, what is a good book? What makes a good book? Not so much and you get into that discussion where, you know, I love this book because it said this to me, but it doesn't speak to a different person. And I think that's a different argument than whether or not a book is just not well written. I think there are some books that just speak to people. And so I don't know, what's your take on that?
I think that's the great unanswerable question, you know, and what is a good book, because it's so, and I think that's also, too, why it's important for writers. At some point you have to write for yourself, I think, because how can you judge that? I mean, like I said, outside of paying attention to craft, you know, and writing and things like that, those are the things that you can address and that you can work on yourself at your desk or your computer or whatever. But whether or not what you write, for example, you know, especially if you're going to take a chance and latch onto something that's trending, you know, it's always iffy, because what if it's not trending by the time you get done, you know. I think, again, whatever you're writing, you know, I don't know. It's a hard question to answer. I think it goes back to, again, you know, why are you writing it? Robert McCammon, who wrote Boy's Life, one of my favorite novels, wrote so many other novels. He has an essay on his blog, called My Calling, and he states in there that the biggest reason why he writes is he has a story that he wants to hear. He writes it because he wants to hear. He writes the type of stories that he would like to read and that he wants to hear. And I think that's probably the best thing we can do as writers, because who knows who's going to like what we write. You know what I mean? It's so hard to predict. You could say I'm writing popular fiction, I'm writing literary fiction, I'm writing experimental fiction, and there could be a market for it. Maybe there's not a market for it. Maybe sparkling vampires is the trend this year. You write your sparkling vampire novel, and sorry, it's too late. That's not a trend anymore. So I think it's so important as a writer to like the craft is a different. Like I always think of it as like craft is the mechanics of the novel. Like even Charles Grant, who's a wonderful writer, he wrote his three Hammer novels. The Hammer-esque novels where he wrote the classic vampire novel, werewolf novel, mummy novel. He wrote them simply to prove that, look, you can write this canned, stereotypical story and still write the prose very well. You know what I mean? So I think the prose is a mechanical thing that we work at, we labor at through writing and rewriting and editing. But as far as the stories themselves, again, I think we have to get to a point where, on one hand, you want it to be accessible to people, but on the other hand, you have to also write for yourself, and then again, that's a tenuous balance, and you can never predict. Like Paul Wilson and Repairman Jack. I don't know if you've read any of those novels, but they're widely loved. And he had just written one novel with Jack and didn't even plan on bringing him back. He wanted Jack to die at the end of the book, and then like 10 years later, he wanted to go write other stuff. And all of his readers were like, no, bring back Jack. So 15 books later, here he's got Jack, and he never intended for that to happen. That's the unpredictable nature of the beast, I think.
Yeah, I think so too, and I think there definitely is, as a writer, something to be said for, writing what you feel you need to write, but also not being too indulgent.
Right.
Because that's a lot of argument with memoir. I know, because I have a couple of friends of mine and that I went to college with, and we still go back and forth about memoir. It's like you can still take your life story and turn it into fiction and ultimately make that speak louder rather than saying I. Because sometimes the I people can't relate to you. Right.
Yeah, that's it. I think you kind of hit the key thing right there. Is it can be personal, but you want it still to be accessible to other people. And
accessible and entertaining.
Yes, yeah. At the end of the day, I think it was I always keep that in the back of my head, because it's funny as a reader, I feel like I have two primary influences. I really read very heavily. The Charles Grant and Ramsey Campbell and T.M. Wright, people that have done some really Ray Bradbury, people who have done some wonderful things with language, but then I also, I read all the Repairman Jack novels, there are Brian Keene novels I love, because these are guys that have just been able to write that story that a lot of people like, and in the end, we want readers and things like that, but we want to be true to ourselves. So it's kind of a little dance you got to play with yourself, But and Bradbury's a good example, though. Bradbury's a good example of a guy who did wonderful things with the language, but his writing was so diverse. So many people love him. You know what I mean? So he was able to do that, and be able to straddle that. He's writing, being very artful with his prose, but then lots of people still like it. So.
Again, I mean, if you look at the difference from his collection, say, like, one of my favorite collections of his is October Sky. And
October Sky or October Country?
October Country, sorry, October Sky. I'm getting that confused with the book, but the novel I'm talking about, which isn't by him, it's by somebody else. But it's probably just because they're next to each other on my bookshelf, because that's the way I filed them. But October Country, his original story, The Lake, is in there. But if you look at some of the other stories in there, one of the core themes in the October Country collection is the marital relationship Not in every single story, but in most of them, I believe.
That's huge in the Next in Line,
yeah.
which ironically my honors students are reading that story right now, and we're supposed to talk about that on, I think, Thursday.
Yeah,
that's the October Country is some of his earliest fiction, and I love that collection. And there's a lot of really like personal themes, I think, but they're still entertaining stories.
Yeah, like the one about the wind. That's in there too, right? I don't remember the title of it, but it's the two guys and they're in the house and they feel like the wind is coming.
I think it may just be the wind. I'm not sure. I think he has a...
Yeah, I think it is called The Wind.
Yep.
I think it is just called The Wind.
Yeah,
and it's totally creepy. It's like there's... Yeah. He's like, oh, I can hear it, and I just remember reading that. And I read it down at the beach. My parents had a private beach, and I took it down there one summer, and I read it in like 2 days. I just laid there for 2 days. I could not put this book down. But there was one night when I was there, and it was like actually almost 9 o'clock, which meant that the sun was setting. And I happened to be reading that story about the wind. And it was so creepy on that lake, even though it was the middle of August, at 9 o'clock at night. I was like, okay, really, I need to go home. And I didn't finish the story until the next day. But that was, that deals with heavy marital issues, and yet you look at the Martian Chronicles, which deals with much more existential issues.
And very political in its own way. When you're talking about colonialism and expansion and things like that, very, very, very political. But we're gonna put it in the trappings of science fantasy. So I read that this summer. Also reread that. So.
Yeah, and there's that one scene where they all look in the, where the guy says the father says to the kids, look into the river, and you'll see the Martians, and it's themselves.
Yep.
That was why that novel said, I know it's very political, but it almost spoke existential to me rather than political. But Fahrenheit 451 to me just screams politics.
Oh, sure it does. Sure. And going back with the existential political, I think it's colonialism and expansionism and things like that.
Oh, they are political,
On the one side, it is political, but when you're talking about those sort of things, whether or not we have the right to do this and who we are to do this, that does become a very existential question, absolutely. And Fahrenheit 451 is one of the first books I have my freshmen read every year, because I'm just like, listen, I said, I know every English teacher likes to say this is the most important book you'll ever read, but I'm always like, this is the most important book you will ever read, because this is happening right now. This is something that Bradbury saw coming. I said, you'll find some of the science fiction elements, the technology sounds very golden age and it's out of date, but the way he predicted this society, without, and I'm not an alarmist. I am not political. I'm not one of these doomsday people, but I don't see how you can read Fahrenheit 451 and then not recognize the startling similarities to where we are right now today as a society. So
no, I would have to agree with you.
Yeah,
absolutely. We have about 7 minutes left, Kevin. So would you just like to talk a little bit about Anthocon before I thank you and we sign off for the evening? Sure.
Anthocon is Shroud Publishing's conference. It was in its maiden year last year, and it was a really nice little conference. Because I traveled around with Tim to a couple conferences. We used to meet out of Context every year, and I know that he developed Anthocon specifically kind of in response to how he felt other conventions were run. And he felt, I'm traveling all over the country to go to these conventions. I think I can put on a really great convention myself. So that was how Anthocon was born last year. It's in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. I've been posting links here throughout the whole show on the blog talk thing. Anthocon is going to be in its second year this year. It's a really nice conference. It's not a horror convention. It's a speculative conference. And it's a nice little, convention that's very well run. is very friendly. It's all geared toward the writers, and I think he's done a really nice job of balancing, panels and readings and things like that. And it was fairly well attended last year. And I know this year, one of our keynote guests is going to be Gary Braunbeck, who's one of my favorite authors, and Rick Catala will be there as well. So it'll be November 9th, 10th, and 11th, and the can't remember what the Anthocon website is.
I think if they just Google Anthocon 2012, it'll come up.
Anthocon 2012, it'll come up.
Yeah, but I think it's like anthocon.com, but I'll put that in the show notes for those of you listeners out there who are interested, because, I know it's not that far away from Canada, so you guys can come down. Hopefully we won't all get wiped out. But no, Anthocon is a lovely conference. I had such a wonderful experience last year, in that it is geared toward the writer, and it's also a very accessible, friendly environment.
Yes,
you can have drinks with the people that you've read their books, and you can see very quickly that we're all real people. Like, we're not famous, we're not, we're just real people. And Tim has done a wonderful job with the organizing of that. And I'm really looking forward to this year because I think, the first time you have any con, there's inevitably going to be little things you need to fix. And I didn't notice anything last year, but it looks like they've really stepped it up this year. And I'm like, oh, that's cool. Like, things I didn't notice last year, but apparently they did. So I think that's a wonderful thing. So, is there anything you'd like to add, Kevin, before we sign off?
Other than that, I said, I had a good time, and if you want to visit my blog at my website at www.kevinlucia.com. I kind of made a little entry there, just for tonight, just to point people, into directions. My podcast with Tales of Terrify and my novella, part one of my serial novella. It's in Lamplight magazine, where the first issues for free, and that's probably about it. It was a lot of fun, and thanks for having me on.
Oh, thank you, Kevin, and I really look forward to talking to you at Anthocon and hanging out. You're going to be there, I assume, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Like I said, bringing the whole family, bringing the wife and kids, so it should be a good time. Yeah,
are you staying at the Holiday Inn, or are you staying next door? Because I know they changed it.
We'll be staying at the Holiday Inn. Because they changed it to the new. We're gonna be staying where it's based. Yeah. That's what I'm gonna do too.
Yep. So that should be good, and I should be getting there relatively early enough on Friday to actually hang out. Because I know last year I got there at like 10 o'clock, and it was just like, okay, next year I have to make a mental note and come earlier. But yeah, no, it was really great, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you. And I thank you so much for coming on the show. And to those of our listeners out there, under the guest links and books page, there is a link to Kevin Lucia's website. There's a link to his page on his website where you can get his free fiction and all the links to his stories in the anthologies. And certainly if you liked what you heard of Hiram Grange tonight, go check it out. That link is there as well. So anyway, this has been episode 9 of Scary Scribes. I'd like to thank Terry Koenig of the Paranormal A Radio Network. And he hosts our program and runs the board for us. And not only can you pick up Paranormal A Radio on the Blog Talk channel in iTunes, you can hear us on Stitcher. Listen to us on your iPhone, Android phone, Kindle Fire, and other devices. Find it in your app store or check the logo to go to Stitcher.com. Stitcher Smart Radio, the smarter way to listen to radio. I'm your host, Christy Peterson Schoonover, and I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Scary Scribes with Kevin Lucia. Keep up with us on our website at www.scaryscribes.com, which has our past episodes and links to any of the writers' websites and books. And like us on Facebook at www.facebook.com/Scary Scribes. Here's to Sleeping with the Lights On, and here is our outro because I figured out how to play it. And if you're on the New England coastline, stay safe during Sandy.
You've been listening to Scary Scribes on the Paranormal A Radio Network. You can follow us at scaryscribes.com or www.facebook.com facebook.com/Scary Scribes. Join us next time, and until then, remember, you don't have to be afraid of the dark. You have to be afraid of what's watching you in the dark.